Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, Episode 45, Bickering Bishops and Papal Politics. In the Middle Ages, everything was connected to the Church in some way or another, and it is worth looking into how the Duke of Burgundy interacted with that institution. Philip the Good was personally quite devout. He founded religious institutions and gave alms. He always traveled with a personal chapel, and he dreamt of going on crusade. Even though the Duke often stayed up late partying, or working hard if you believe his propagandists, the Duke did receive a papal dispensation to hear Mass in the afternoon, and so while he often slept through morning Mass, he never went a day without hearing it. But the Duke's personal devotion was only a small part of the relationship between Burgundy and the Church, and in this episode, we will be focusing on the political relationship. Some form of Burgundian interaction occurred with basically all levels of the church hierarchy. Parish priests, cathedral canons, bishops, abbots, and even the Pope all had their own relationship with Philip and his court, and the Duke of Burgundy was always looking to build his influence in the church. He would do this in a few ways, but the most effective was making sure that his men were appointed to sees throughout the Burgundian state and in nearby territories. Throughout his life, the Duke of Burgundy was able to appoint hundreds, possibly even thousands, of clerics to various offices. These offices could range from a simple parish priesthood to the abbacy of a monastery, or the bishopric of a city. Benefices were an important part of Philip's network of patronage. Through handing them out, the Duke was able to reward his officers and courtiers for good service, give his family members something to do, and make sure that the local church was staffed with clergy loyal to him. Sometimes the Duke even managed to grant an office in commendam, which meant that the holder of the office received its revenue, but without any expectation of living where it was located, or doing any of the duties associated with it. These kinds of grants were a nice reward to hand out, but quite hated by anyone who actually wanted those duties done. The Reformation is on the horizon. Anyways, Philip gained the ability to distribute these benefices in a few ways. Some he was able to appoint simply by virtue of being the lord of a territory. For example, in this period, the Count of Holland had the right to appoint priests to about a third of the county's parish churches, and about half of the canon seats. These rights had been secured by previous Counts of Holland, and were now considered just another part of the job, and had little to do with any move by Philip himself. At other times, the Duke of Burgundy was granted the right to dole out benefices from the Pope or other church leaders. Philip the Good had an especially good relationship with the papacy, and the popes were almost always willing to confirm a Burgundian-backed candidate, or even wholly abdicate the decision-making process to the Duke. Richard Vaughan simply writes that, quote, "As to papally conceded appointments to benefices, these were literally showered on Philip the Good." Burgundian whims often took precedence over the wishes of the people who actually lived there, and the election of a bishop by the canons of a cathedral, or the election of an abbot by the monks of a monastery, could be overturned by a compliant pope. We can see a good illustration of Philip's patronage in the career of Guillaume Fillastre. Fillastre was made the abbot of the monastery of Saint-Bertin over the objections of the monks who lived there, but his appointment was enforced by the Might of Burgundy, and later confirmed by the Pope. However, Fillastre held the post in commendam, and never did much as the abbot of Saint-Bertin. He was busy both at the court of Burgundy, serving as the chancellor of the Order of the Golden Fleece, and acting as one of Philip's ambassadors, as well as serving as the bishop of Verdun, Toul, and Tournai, albeit in succession rather than simultaneously. Now, not everyone received as much advancement in the church due to ducal patronage as Fillastre, but the Duke's influence was widespread. Richard Vaughan adds that, quote, the wholesale intrusion of Philip the Good's courtiers, officials, relatives, and followers into the bishoprics, abbeys, and churches of his territories and neighboring lands worked significantly towards the creation of a specifically Burgundian church, and, indirectly, helped to unify the Burgundian state. Philip had almost total control over the bishoprics in his territory. The seats of Chalon, Auxerre, Mâcon, Thérouanne, and Arras, among others, were held by a succession of Burgundian candidates. And we can also see Burgundian influence in the technically autonomous bishoprics, which formed enclaves in Burgundian territory. Besançon was an imperial free city, and so technically it was completely independent from Burgundy, despite being right in the middle of the Franche-Comté. The city was governed jointly by the bishop and the magistracy of Besançon, but Philip the Bold and John the Fearless had managed to wring out concessions from the town and bishop. And while they were unable to control the city outright, they made sure that their influence was definitely felt. Philip the Good continued to build Burgundian influence in Besançon, and exploited a few disputes between the bishop and the municipal government to increase his hold on the city. The bishops of Besançon tended to be pro-Burgundian in their outlook, and in the second half of Philip the Good's reign, he would be able to appoint a few of his own men to the see of Besançon. Emperor Sigismund attempted to break Philip's hold on the city by reassigning the rights which the Dukes of Burgundy had wrung out, but everyone kind of just ignored this, and Philip maintained his influence. Also of note were the bishoprics of Cambrai and Tournai, which formed enclaves between the counties of Artois and Hainaut and Flanders and Hainaut, respectively. Cambrai was easily influenced by Burgundy, and when the bishop died in 1439, Philip was able to get his illegitimate brother John appointed as his successor. John of Burgundy was the poster child of the inattentive prelate, as he only visited Cambrai once during his 40-year tenure as bishop. But his appointment still marks another step towards Burgundian domination. Tournai was a bit more complicated, as the bishopric had a long tradition of loyalty to the French crown. Both Philip the Bold and John the Fearless managed to appoint Burgundian officials to the see of Tournai, but those bishops were still only one element of the bishopric. The patricians of the city of Tournai held a lot of power, and both the patriciate and the ecclesiastical elements of the government wanted to maintain some harmony so that the urban workers couldn't rise up against them. All this is to say is that, while the bishop of Tournai, Jean de Toisy, might have been willing to sign on to the Treaty of Troyes, the patriciate certainly wasn't, and Toisy figured that acknowledging Charles VII but maintaining good relations with Burgundy was the key to maintaining his own office and maintaining peace in Tournai. And he was right, for the most part. Shortly after the Treaty of Troyes was signed, Philip entered into a treaty of neutrality with Tournai. This treaty would be briefly threatened when the artisans overthrew the patrician and episcopal government, but after less than a year, the elites were back in power, and the treaty was renewed. Through this treaty, the Duke was able to maintain a good relationship with Tournai, as well as extract some tribute in exchange for not attacking it. Tournai thus balanced its relationship with France and Burgundy well for a number of contentious years. But in 1433, Jean de Toisy died, and both Charles VII and Philip the Good wanted to secure the loyalty of the next bishop of Tournai. Philip encouraged the chapter of Tournai to elect Jean Chevreul, one of the Duke's most trusted counselors, while Charles VII put forward Jean d'Harcourt, the Bishop of Amiens, who had remained a steadfast supporter of the king despite holding a see in Burgundian territory. While Philip appealed to the town of Tournai, Charles appealed to Rome, and Pope Eugenius IV agreed to appoint Jean d'Harcourt to the see of Tournai before Philip had the chance to make his own case. The Duke of Burgundy did not appreciate Harcourt's occupation of Tournai, and he wrote to the Pope to try and get the decision overturned, and to the people of Tournai to encourage them to reject Harcourt and follow Chevreul. But the people of Tournai ended up accepting the Pope's decision, and Jean d'Harcourt was able to take his place as their bishop. Philip the Good was quite unhappy with this turn of events, and was able to prevent his lands within the diocese of Tournai from sending money to the bishop, And as almost the entirety of the Diocese of Tournai was in Flanders and Artois, this meant that just about all of the revenue of the diocese was cut off. After 2 years of Burgundian lobbying, Pope Eugenius was convinced to reverse his decision. He promoted Harcourt to the Archbishopric of Narbonne, and appointed Chevreau to take his place in Tournai. However, Harcourt refused the promotion and found support in Charles VII, the Council of Basel, which was currently embroiled in a power struggle with the Pope, and the people of Tournai. Philip was even more annoyed that Tournai was unwilling to accept Chevreau now that the Pope had ruled in his favor, and so decided to institute a commercial boycott of the bishopric. Tournai was completely surrounded by Philip's territories, so this was a big deal. The economy of the bishopric ground to a halt, and less than a year later, Jean de Harcourt agreed to move on to Narbonne, and Jean Chevreau was installed at Tournai. This whole struggle for control of Tournai lasted about 5 years, but in the end, Philip the Good emerged victorious, and strengthened his influence in the bishopric. Chevreau's successor would be even more of a Burgundian agent, as he would be replaced by Guillaume Fillastre in 1460. Filastre's appointment to Tournai was objected to by Charles VII, but this time Philip had gotten his man in first, and the Pope was happy to confirm the Burgundian candidate before another one could be brought forward. So for the most part, the Duke of Burgundy was able to dominate his bishoprics and the bishoprics which formed enclaves in his territories. However, there were also 2 major prince-bishoprics which bordered his territory, Utrecht and Liège, and their relationship with the Duke of Burgundy was not nearly as smooth. The bishops of Utrecht and Liège both controlled fairly large principalities with restive populations, and the bishoprics could not be dominated in the way that Tournai, Cambrai, or Besançon could. While Philip was able to get his chosen candidate on the episcopal thrones of those 3 bishoprics, he was unable to do so in Utrecht and Liège, at least at this point. Just as Holland and Zeeland had to deal with the partisan conflict between the Hooks and the Cods, in Utrecht, the Lichtenbergers and the Lochorstins battled for supremacy. So when the Bishop of Utrecht died in 1423, both parties wanted their chosen candidate to win. The episcopal election of 1423 was a fairly convoluted affair, and half a dozen or so men were considered, with each being backed by a nearby magnate. But in the end, support from the Lichtenbergers coalesced around Rudolf von Diepholz, while the Lochorstins backed Zweiter von Kulenburg. Rudolf von Diepholz managed to curry more support within Utrecht, and was elected bishop by the canons of the bishopric, but he was rejected by the Pope. Pope Martin V had his eye on another candidate, but that man declined the appointment, and so rather than confirm the decision of the canons, Martin was convinced to back Zweiter von Kulenburg by Philip the Good. Over the next few years, Diepholz and Kulenburg battled for supremacy in Utrecht. Despite aid from Burgundy and backing from Rome, Zweiter and the Lochorstins were generally in the weaker position, and even though they briefly gained control of around half of the bishopric in 1425, by 1426 Zweiter von Kulenburg had been chased out of Utrecht, and Rudolf von Diepholz was firmly in charge. Philip the Good still recognized Zweiter's claim to Utrecht, and so Rudolf decided to back Jacqueline of Bavaria's claim to Holland and Zeeland. Soldiers from Utrecht took part in a number of campaigns and battles on Jacqueline's behalf, and Philip's largest disappointment in the war for Holland and Zeeland was his utter failure to dislodge Rudolf von Diepholz from Utrecht. Soon after the Treaty of Delft was signed between Philip and Jacqueline, the Duke of Burgundy made peace with the Bishop of Utrecht. Rudolf von Diepholz recognized Philip as the ruler of Holland and Zeeland, and, in turn, Philip recognized Rudolf as the Bishop of Utrecht. There were some minor provisions meant to appease Philip's honor and prestige, but really it was an acknowledgement from both parties that they could not dislodge the other. Not long after Philip made peace with his rival, Zweiter von Kulenburg was dealt another blow when Pope Martin V died, and his successor, Pope Eugenius IV, acknowledged Rudolf as well. Unwilling to concede the issue, Zweiter appealed to the Council of Basel for support, and as the Council of Basel was always willing to oppose Eugenius on anything, he was recognized by the council. However, this acknowledgement did little to change the situation, and things could have ended in 1433 when Zweiter died. But the Council of Basel and Emperor Sigismund decided to prolong the Utrecht Schism by electing Walraven of Meurs as the successor to Zweiter's claim. Walraven's brother was embroiled in a conflict with Philip's brother-in-law, the Duke of Cleves, so Philip the Good and Rudolf von Diepholz found their interests aligned for a while. In the end, foreign actors would be unable to drive Rudolf out of power in Utrecht, but the people of Utrecht were another story. A few years after Walraven conceded to Rudolf, the two men found themselves fighting side by side in the Münster diocesan feud. We really don't need to know the details of this feud, so much as Rudolf's participation in it was unpopular in Utrecht, and the taxes he was levying to pay for all of these disputes were even more unpopular. The later years of Rudolf's time as Bishop of Utrecht were turbulent ones, and by the time he died in 1455, he had lost much of his authority in the bishopric. The election of Rudolf's successor will be just as contested as Rudolf's election was, but we're going to leave it here for now, and we'll probably dedicate an episode to that affair once we reach it in the narrative. So now, on to Liège. The ever-turbulent Prince Bishopric hasn't really popped up in our story since John the Fearless quashed a Liégeois uprising at the Battle of Auty back in 1408. In the years after Auty, John the Pitiless, then the Bishop of Liège, worked to better his relationship with the Liégeois, and the rest of his time as bishop was relatively quiet. But that time as bishop would end prematurely when John the Pitiless renounced his see in order to stake his claim to Holland and Zeeland in 1418. Philip the Good, still Count of Charolais here, tried to get the chapter of Liège to elect a pro-Burgundian candidate, but the clergy of Liège wanted to preserve the prince-bishopric's independence and rebuffed his attempts. After a brief pit stop through another short-lived bishop, John of Heinsberg, the son of an influential Liégeois noble, was chosen to become the new prince-bishop. Much like John the Pitiless before him, John of Heinsberg was not a member of the clergy when he was chosen, and so he was quickly ordained. But unlike John the Pitiless, John of Heinsberg actually ended up taking the proper holy orders required of a bishop, and so we can actually refer to him as the Prince-Bishop of Liège, rather than the Prince-Bishop-elect. But even though John of Heinsberg did take the proper holy orders, he would be just as worldly as John the Pitiless. John of Heinsberg was certainly no Burgundian agent, but as he was surrounded by Burgundian lands and Burgundian allies, it was in his best interests to maintain good relations with the Duke. And so, in 1421, John of Heinsberg and Philip the Good signed a limited treaty of alliance. This didn't really bring Liège into the Burgundian fold so much as it secured a decent working relationship between the two lords. And over the next few years, that relationship would remain steady. However, things would change in 1429 when Philip got involved in a dispute between the towns of Bouvignes and Dinant. These towns had been rivals and enemies since time immemorial, and were just about a mile away from each other on opposite banks of the Meuse River. Dinant was in Liège, while Bouvignes was a part of the county of Namur. Hostilities between Dinant and Bouvignes were not an uncommon occurrence, and the Dinanters had built a tower across the Meuse from their rival town to menace the people of Bouvignes. This tower, known as Montorgueil, was supposed to be demolished as a part of the settlement which John the Fearless had imposed on Liège after Auty. But this was not done, and Montorgueil remained a symbol of Liégeois defiance. Over the years, Philip the Good would repeatedly demand that Dinant demolish Montorgueil, but he was repeatedly fobbed off. Philip the Good was not yet the Count of Namur, but he had bought the right to inherit the county back in 1421, and included in that deal was the right to garrison a few places in Namur, including Bouvignes. The double insult of the threat to Bouvines and the snubbing of the peace deal imposed by his father enraged Philip, and so in early 1429 he sent a detachment of the Burgundian garrison of Bouvines across the Meuse to take Montorgueil. However, the assault on the tower was unsuccessful and only angered the Dinanters. They sent a delegation complaining to Philip, who was coincidentally playing host to both the Count of Namur and the Bishop of Liège at the time. Over the next year or so, a tense truce held, as the grievances between Liège, Namur, and Burgundy were discussed over the course of a series of diplomatic summits. In this time, the Count of Namur died, and Philip finally took possession of the county. But by the summer of 1430, the Liégeois had had enough of these summits and decided to declare war on the Duke of Burgundy. This put John of Heinsberg in a bit of a difficult position. At the moment, he was personally on very good terms with Philip the Good, but to oppose his subjects could invite their wrath, and he could find himself chased out of Liège, just as John the Pitiless was in 1407. The Bishop of Liège decided that he would be better served following his subjects than the Duke of Burgundy, and so officially declared war on Philip. But Richard Vaughan notes that this was done, quote, in the mildest and politest manner possible, and we can see for ourselves, quote, "Most high, most noble, and most mighty Prince, Philip, Duke of Burgundy, Count of Artois, Flanders, and Burgundy, etc. Notwithstanding that I, John of Heinsberg, Bishop of Liège and Count of Lune, in virtue of certain statements that have passed between us, have made frequent applications to you for reparation according to the claims declared in these aforementioned statements, which have been but little attended to, and that divers great and abominable outrages have been committed by your captains and servants on my country and subjects, which, if it may please you to remember, have been fully detailed in the complaints that were made to you thereon. Nevertheless, most high, noble, and mighty Prince, although your answers have been very gracious, and although you declare your intentions of preserving a good understanding between us, your promises have hitherto been without effect. And these matters are now so much entangled with others, no wise concerning them, that it is very grievous to us, and most highly displeasing. Most high, noble, and mighty Prince, you must, in your wisdom, know that by reason of my oath to remain faithful to my church and country, it behooves me to support and defend their rights against all who may attempt to infringe them, with the whole force I shall be possessed of. For this reason, most high, noble, and mighty Prince, after my humble salutations and excuses, I must again inform you of these things, and, should they be continued, opposition will be made thereto, so that my honor may be preserved." Philip the Good was besieging Compiègne when he received the declaration of war, and the chronicler Enguerrand de Monstrelet claims that the Liégeois were convinced to open hostilities by ambassadors of Charles VII as a way to distract the Duke of Burgundy. But it is just as likely that the Liégeois saw the siege of Compiègne as the distraction, and decided that now would just be a good time to settle their score with the Duke. Regardless, Philip remained at Compiègne, but he did send Knight of the Golden Fleece Antoine de Croix to Namur with a force of around 800 men to face down the Liégeois. Hostilities were soon opened as an army from Liège invaded and pillaged Namur and Hainaut. These raids were destructive, but they didn't really have much of a strategic impact. As the raids were ongoing, the forces of Dinant were preparing for the central operation of the campaign, a siege of Bouvines. According to an anonymous chronicler, the men of Dinant constructed a giant wooden cat, which they could wheel up to the walls of Bouvines to protect the attackers from arrows, crossbow bolts, and artillery fire from the defenders. The wheels of this feline siege engine were not greased, and so the defenders of Bouvines could hear the squeaking of the wheels, or, if you prefer, the meowing of the cat, from Dinant as it set out. Around 200 men were inside the cat, while another 2,000 or so crossbowmen marched beside it. As the Trojan cat approached Bouvines, the defenders of the town began shooting at it. The standard ballistics had little effect on the cat, but the captain of the Burgundian garrison of the town was well prepared, with cannonballs filled with oil and fire arrows. Once these were employed, the cat was set alight before it could reach the walls. Rather than defending the men inside from missile fire, it trapped them in a blaze. With their mighty cat set on fire and their men-at-arms cooking, the army from Liège and Dinant realized that they now had little chance of taking Bouvignes, and withdrew soon after. The rest of the war was, for the most part, made up of a series of raids and counter-raids. No word on if any other wooden animals took part. And the fighting would go on until late 1431, when an outbreak of plague put an end to it. It does seem that the Burgundians held the advantage by the end, as the ensuing peace deal was quite favorable to the Duke. He gave up nothing, while Liège agreed to pay an indemnity of 100,000 nobles, and to demolish Montorgueil. I'm not exactly sure how much of the indemnity would end up being collected, but I do know that the Tower of Montorgueil continued to be a sore spot for the Duke for years, and it was not until the 1440s that it was actually demolished. In 1434, Philip the Good was able to get John of Heinsberg to agree to another personal alliance. However, the Bishop of Liège was still his own man, and for the next 2 decades he continued to balance Burgundian influence and his restless subjects. There were a few minor revolts against the bishop here and there, but nothing on the scale of the 1407-1408 revolt against John the Pitiless. Moreover, there were occasional disagreements between John of Heinsberg and Philip the Good, but at no other point were hostilities between the bishop and the duke opened. John of Heinsberg proved to be a moderating influence on Liège. He was a native son of the bishopric, and so genuinely desired to maintain its independence from Burgundy. But, at the same time, he was aware that a good relationship with Burgundy was necessary to maintain that independence. John cultivated generally good relations with both his subjects and the Duke, even as their interests diverged. The bishop managed to remain in power in Liège for over 35 years, an impressive feat considering the troubles that his predecessor and successor ran into. But in the end, he would relent to pressure from the Duke of Burgundy to resign from his post. We'll catch up with Liège again in the 1450s, but now it's time to move on from regional politics to international politics. I've mentioned a few times so far that the Duke of Burgundy had a good relationship with the papacy, and this relationship would benefit both the Duke and a succession of popes. Now, Rome and Burgundy were not always on the same page, but in general, Philip could count on the support of the papacy, and vice versa. We've already seen the Duke of Burgundy benefit from a good relationship with the Pope in the course of the struggle for Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland. Even though Pope Martin V revoked his initial dispensation for Jacqueline and John IV's marriage, he did re-grant it after an appeal from a Burgundian embassy, and, moreover, his confirmation of Jacqueline's marriage to John, and consequent denial of her marriage to Humphrey of Gloucester in 1428, was a major blow to her cause. The Burgundian takeover of Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland might not have been possible without support from Rome. Papal dispensations had also proven useful in Philip's other matrimonial plans, such as his marriage to Bonne of Artois and his sister Agnes's marriage to the Count of Clermont. But these dispensations were far from the extent that the Duke benefited from his relationship with the papacy. As we explored earlier, the popes were happy to confirm a Burgundian bishop or abbot, and this happened with a good deal of regularity throughout the Burgundian domains, and in neighboring territories as well, albeit with mixed success, as we've also explored earlier. Moreover, Philip the Good was not the only claimant to Hainaut, Holland, Zeeland, and Brabant, and Emperor Sigismund was keen to exorcise the Duke of Burgundy from the Holy Roman Empire. To that end, he recognized rival claims to the territories on a few occasions. So, having the Pope officially confirm that Philip was indeed the rightful ruler of these lands was a useful legitimizer. In 1438, Charles VII issued the Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges, which, among other things, asserted that the Church of France was largely independent from Rome. The Pragmatic Sanction limited what funds could be sent to Rome, and thus kept much of the money raised from tithes and other church exactions in the Kingdom of France. It also limited the Pope's ability to interfere with the appointment of French clergy, and prevented most disputes within the French Church from being appealed to Rome. The pragmatic sanction was not popular in Rome, but a few years later, Pope Eugenius would make similar concessions to the Duke of Burgundy for his lands in the empire. Through his good relationship with the papacy, Philip was able to continually build his influence over the Burgundian Church, and emphasize the fact that Burgundy was a power in its own right. But what did the popes get out of all of this? One thing, which we'll explore later on in Philip's reign, is his desire to go on crusade. While the idea of crusading was still popular in the 15th century, there weren't many great lords who were willing to commit to one. And while the Duke of Burgundy would not end up going on crusade, he was one of the most zealous advocates for one. The popes were also able to find support from Burgundy in their conflict with the Council of Basel. A little while ago, I was talking with Bree from the Pontifex podcast, and the subject of church councils came up. Bree remarked that with church councils, if it's not a weird supernatural moment, it's petty drama. I definitely agree with that assessment, and find the Council of Basel in particular to be one of the councils most consumed by petty drama. Church councils, or synods if you prefer, had been around since the 300s, and were called with more or less frequency in the centuries since. The conciliar movement, which dominated the Council of Basel, has its roots in the Western Schism. As the nearly 40 years with 2 and then 3 rival popes had greatly diminished the prestige of the papacy as an institution, and opened the door for a council to take charge of the church. The leaders of Latin Christendom, both lay and clerical, spent decades trying to resolve the schism, and in 1409, the Council of Pisa was called to try and end it. However, this council only ended up adding a third pope into the mix. But in 1414, the leaders of the church tried again with the Council of Constance. This council proved to be more effective, and in the end, the rival popes were deposed, and Martin V was elected and acknowledged by almost the entirety of the church. But before Martin was elected, the Council of Constance declared that church councils held superiority over the pope, and that church councils must be called regularly. After his election, Martin V's authority was pretty shaky, and so he couldn't really oppose these measures without risking another schism. Martin did his duty and called the Council of Pavia-Siena in 1423, but due to an outbreak of the plague, the council was dispersed before any significant action could be taken, and Martin must have let out a sigh of relief. Pope Martin then agreed to call another council in 1431, but he died before it could be convened, and so it fell to his successor, Pope Eugenius IV, to deal with it. Churchmen began to arrive in Basel in the spring of 1431, but the opening of the council was delayed due to a brief war between the Dukes of Burgundy and Austria, which I'll cover in the next episode. Finally, in December, a quorum was reached, and almost immediately the council found itself in conflict with Eugenius. Before 1431 was even over, Eugenius attempted to dissolve the council, twice, but these attempts only further cemented the divisions between pope and council. Over the next several years, the conflict between the Council of Basel and Eugenius would wax and wane, but mostly wax. Philip the Good had initially taken up a fairly neutral position in this dispute, but as it continued, he began to side with the Pope more and more, and Burgundian delegates to the Council of Basel repeatedly spoke in favor of the Pope and urged reconciliation. This proved effective, at least for a time, and in 1433 and 1434, relations between Eugenius and Basel were about as good as they would ever be, in part due to efforts from the Burgundian delegation. But this was not to last, and as the conflict deepened, the Duke of Burgundy instructed his men to side with the Pope. Throughout the latter half of the 1430s, the reformers in the Council of Basel grew more radical and more unwilling to compromise with Eugenius. The Pope was able to capitalize on a request from delegates of the Byzantine Empire to consider the reunion of the Latin and Greek churches to move the council to Ferrara and then Florence. Closer to the Byzantine Empire, yes, but also closer to Rome, so Eugenius could make his influence more felt. The more radical conciliarists refused to move while the moderates agreed and left Basel. This, of course, only deepened the rift between Basel and Eugenius, and in 1439 the council elected an anti-pope, Amadeus VIII of Savoy, Philip the Good's uncle, who had worked so hard to reconcile France and Burgundy for years. Despite his uncle's elevation, Philip the Good remained loyal to Eugenius. The Duke of Burgundy had sent a delegation to Ferrara and forbade any of his subjects from remaining in Basel. The Duke also forbade any church disputes in his territories from being appealed to Basel, and refused to allow any indulgences, dispensations, or declarations from the council to be circulated in his lands. After 1440, the Council of Basel declined in power and prestige, but this decline would take about a decade to fully play out. So rather than going too far into the future, I want to explore my personal favorite bit of petty drama from the council, the long dispute over where the Burgundian delegation should sit. Now, this might sound a bit silly, and honestly it was, but this squabble was representative of Philip's ambition to be recognized as a ruler of royal stature, and if the Burgundian delegates had been seated alongside the royal delegations without incident, the Duke of Burgundy would have gained real prestige. As it was, the dispute lasted for over a year, and on a few occasions brought the business of the Council of Basel to a halt. There had been a Burgundian presence at Basel since the council opened, but the full Burgundian delegation didn't arrive until 1433, and when they did, they demanded to be seated next to the royal delegations, rather than alongside the other ducal and princely ones. This demand immediately ticked off many of the other delegations, especially the ones from the electors of the Holy Roman Empire, who guarded their own precedents jealously. At first, the decision was made to refer back to the Council of Constance, but the churchmen who were also present at Constance could not remember exactly where the Burgundians sat, although many did suggest that they thought the Burgundians were behind the electors. The delegations from the electors argued that just as the cardinals who elected the Pope had precedence over the other clerics of the church, they should have precedence over the non-royal princes, as they elected the emperor. The leader of the Burgundian delegation, Jean Germain, the Bishop of Nevers and current Chancellor of the Order of the Golden Fleece, had some arguments of his own. He pointed out that Philip the Good was descended from the kings of France and from Charlemagne, and he pointed to Philip's relations to the royal houses of England, Castile, Navarre, Portugal, and Cyprus. And yeah, all of these ties existed, but due to the intermarriage of the European nobility, many of the other dukes of Europe could boast similarly impressive lineages. Germain also emphasized Philip's vast collection of territories, 4 duchies, Burgundy, Brabant, Limburg, and the titular Duchy of Lothair, 15 counties, and numerous other lordships and seigneuries. In our last episode, we saw some of Philip the Good's attempts to emphasize his elevated status, and here we see that the Grand Duke of the West was unwilling to yield precedence to the electors of the empire. After a few months of back and forth, the Burgundians were allowed to be seated ahead of the electors, which outraged the electoral delegations, and a few even threatened to leave the council. Emperor Sigismund, who was always ready to oppose the machinations of the Duke of Burgundy, gave his support to the electoral delegations, and even prevented the Burgundian delegation from attending Christmas Mass in the church cathedral. Sigismund was quite annoyed with the behavior of the Burgundian delegates, and on a few occasions the emperor went on a tirade complaining about Philip's ego, and even accused the entire council of negligence with how long this process was taking. Early in 1434, a delegation from the Duke of Brittany arrived in Basel, and this only complicated the situation. The Bretons also demanded to be seated with precedence above the other dukes, while the Burgundians argued that the Duke of Burgundy was also superior to the Duke of Brittany. The delegations from the Dukes of Brittany and Burgundy both began to pull out more arguments in favor of their precedence, and in the course of this, both denied their master's vassalage to the French crown, which in turn caused the French delegation to lodge a protest against both Brittany and Burgundy. At one point, a solution was put forward where all delegations would have equal precedence, but this solution was met with opposition from the various royal delegations. Finally, in the summer of 1434, a compromise was reached. The major royal delegations would sit at the front, with the more minor royal delegations, the electoral delegations, and the delegations from the Dukes of Brittany and Burgundy seated right behind them. The Burgundian delegation would sit on the right, alongside the delegation from the King of Scotland. The electoral delegations would sit in the center, and the Breton delegation would sit on the left, alongside the delegation from the King of Denmark. Furthermore, it was agreed that the Burgundians would yield to the precedence of the delegations from the crown princes of France, Scotland, Denmark, Aragon, and many other kingdoms. Before this could all be wrapped up, a representative from the Duke of Orleans demanded that his master should also be acknowledged to have an increased level of precedence. But he didn't demand to sit alongside Burgundy or Brittany, so at least the seating chart didn't have to be revised again. With this issue resolved, the council could return to business, but these kinds of disagreements popped up throughout the course of the council. In 1435, another dispute about precedence arose between the English and Castilian delegations, and at one point the Burgundian delegation caused a diplomatic incident when they failed to bow to the Byzantine emperor when he visited the council, which was only resolved when the Burgundians issued a formal apology and claimed that Philip had great respect for the Byzantine emperor. But for now, I'll leave the Council of Basel to continue finding itself embroiled in petty drama and occasionally dealing with actual issues in the church. And it will pop up from time to time in the coming episodes. Next time, we're going to remain in the Holy Roman Empire, but we're going to focus more on lay politics as we explore Philip's relationship and conflicts with Emperor Sigismund and some other imperial princes. Thank you so much to my patrons: Christine, Duchesse de Nemours, Elliot, Graf von Gravenstein, Anthony, Comte de Chateauneuf-en-Auxois, Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau, Mark, Comte de Meursault, Diana, Graf von Beersel, Mehmet, Comte Santerre, Chris, Comte de Semur, David, Graf von Bornum, Rosa, Comte de Germol, Elliot, Comte de Bussy-le-Grand, Quentin, Graf von Blasfeld, Tyler, Comte de Chamaret, Ian, Graf von Arenberg, Eric, Comte de Couche, David, Graf von Barland, Jonathan, Comte de Bazoches, Olivier, Comte d'Ussert, and to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review in your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at ValoisBurgundy on Twitter or Blue Sky, or find Grand Dukes of the West on Facebook. You can also email me at granddukesofthewest.com and check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at granddukesofthewest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.